The alleyway smelled of wet cardboard, rust, and impending death. Jo-ong didn't hesitate. With a blur of motion, he slammed Valeria against the peeling brick wall, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. The metallic clack of his customized Desert Eagle cocking was the only sound in the dead of night. "You've been selling my movements to the Volkovs," Moon stated. His voice wasn't angry, it was terrifyingly hollow. He was the king of Chicago, a man who had accepted that his empire would die with him because he was broken, medically sterile, a genetic dead end. Betrayal was just another disappointment in a lonely life. He pressed the cold steel against her temple. He expected her to beg. He expected tears. Instead, Valeria wasn't looking at the gun. Her eyes were darting frantically, terrified, toward the cracked apartment door behind her. "No, please, not here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Moon tightened his finger on the trigger, but before he could end her, the rusted door creaked open. A toddler, no more than 3 years old, stumbled into the damp hallway. He rubbed sleep from his face, looking confused but strangely unafraid. He looked up at the giant man threatening his mother, and Moon froze. The boy didn't have brown eyes. He didn't have hazel eyes. He looked up with steel gray eyes, cold, predatory, distinct. They were the exact eyes Moon saw in the mirror every morning, the genetic signature of a bloodline the doctors swore ended with him. Moon's heart hammered against his ribs. The gun, once light as a feather, suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He lowered the weapon, his breath hitching in his throat as he stared at the impossible. "Who?" Moon's voice cracked, shattering his composure. "Who is this?" But 24 hours earlier, Jo-ong didn't know he was a father. He only knew he was a dead end. Standing in his glass-walled penthouse, Moon looked down at Chicago, the city he ruled with surgical precision. He was the outfit's most feared enforcer, a man who possessed everything but a future. The doctors had been clear years ago. A brutal injury had rendered him medically sterile. There would be no heir to the Moon dynasty. The realization had turned him reckless. A king with no legacy has nothing to lose, so he ruled with a cold indifference that terrified even his lieutenants. Then there was the anomaly, Valeria Romano. She was just a ghost in a gray uniform, the maid who scrubbed his marble floors in silence. Moon barely recognized her face, but he noticed the inventory. For weeks, items were vanishing. Not the Rolexes or the cash stacks left on the counter. That he would have understood. It was milk, bread, boxes of cereal. He told himself it was pathetic, petty theft until he found the shattered burner phone buried in the kitchen trash. In Moon's world, a maid with a burner phone wasn't calling a sick relative. She was selling coordinates. Paranoia, his only constant companion, whispered that the quiet woman was a spy for the Volkovs. He didn't call security. He didn't fire her. He decided to hunt. When Valeria clocked out that evening, Moon grabbed his keys and his gun. He needed to verify the betrayal before he executed the traitor. The drive was a descent from heaven straight into hell. Moon steered his sedan away from the glittering Gold Coast and deep into the rust, a decaying district the police had abandoned years ago. Here, the streetlights were broken, and the air tasted of sewage and desperation. It insulted him. He paid his staff a premium wage, yet this was where she returned? This was where the rats lived? He killed the headlights and watched. Valeria didn't go to an apartment. She hurried to a shadowed street corner where a hooded man waited under a flickering neon sign. Moon's jaw tightened. He watched her hand over a wad of crumpled cash, likely the money she saved by stealing his food. In exchange, the man slipped her a small white package. To Moon, the picture was crystal clear. It was a transaction. Whether she was buying drugs to numb the pain or selling the syndicate's secrets to the highest bidder, the result was the same. She was a liability. He felt the familiar coldness wash over him. He didn't need to see more.
He checked the clip in his Desert Eagle and stepped out into the rain, his Italian leather shoes splashing into the grime of the alley. The investigation was over. The execution was next. Moon moved like a phantom through the rot. The wooden stairs screamed under his weight, yet his movements were silent. Through the paper-thin walls, the sounds of the slums bled out, muffled screams, shattering glass, the dull thud of domestic violence. It was a symphony of misery, and he was the conductor arriving to end the show. He reached the 4th floor, stopping outside apartment 4B. He pressed his ear against the rotting wood, his grip tightening on the Desert Eagle. He waited for the evidence. He expected to hear the harsh consonants of a Russian handler or the hushed negotiation of a deal on a burner phone. Instead, he heard a melody. Valeria was singing. It was a soft, trembling lullaby, fragile enough to break. The sound hit Moon harder than a fist. Confusion flickered in his chest. Spies didn't sing to empty rooms. Traitors didn't hum while they counted blood money. But hesitation was a weakness he couldn't afford. He banished the doubt, took a breath, and drove his heel into the lock. The cheap mechanism snapped like a dry twig. He stormed into the darkness, weapon raised, bringing the violence with him. The violence evaporated, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Moon lowered the weapon, his gaze locked on the small boy in the hallway. It wasn't just the steel-gray eyes that paralyzed him. It was the defiant set of the jaw, the sharp, distinctive hairline. It was like staring at a ghost of himself from 30 years ago. Impossible, the word screamed in his mind. The specialists in Zurich had been absolute, sterile, irreparable, a genetic dead end. This had to be a trick, a psychological play by the Volkovs using a look-alike, but the resemblance was too precise to be manufactured. He grabbed Valeria's arm. The cold executioner was gone, replaced by a man desperate for the truth.
"How old is he?" Moon demanded, his voice raspy and unrecognizable. Valeria didn't fight him. She saw the walls of his denial crumbling. 3, she wept, pulling the confused boy against her legs. "He is 3 years old." The number hit Moon like a physical blow. 3 years. The math terrified him. It aligned perfectly with the Jubilee, the anniversary of his father's murder. It was the only night in a decade he had drowned his grief in whiskey. The only night he had woken up with a blank memory and an empty bed. He had assumed he passed out alone. He was wrong. The memory clawed its way through the fog of whiskey and time. The Jubilee. It was the anniversary of the night his father bled out in his arms, and for once, Moon hadn't been a king. He had been a ruin. He remembered stumbling into the penthouse kitchen, trying to drink the ghosts away. That was when Valeria found him. She hadn't cowered like the others. She didn't call security. She saw the man beneath the monster and offered a hand instead of fear. In the haze of grief, boundaries dissolved. It wasn't an assault. It was a desperate collision of 2 lonely souls seeking warmth in the cold. The next morning, the sun was too bright and the bed was empty. Moon had scrubbed the night from his mind, fortified by the medical reports in his safe that promised no consequences could ever exist. Sterile, empty. But as he looked at the boy, those $1,000,000 medical opinions turned to ash. The doctors were wrong. Science had failed, and nature had found a violent, miraculous way. The impotent boss hadn't just lost a maid to the slums. He had unknowingly banished his own blood.
The truth stripped the room naked. Moon looked around, really looked, and felt his soul turn to ice. Black mold crept up the walls like veins, and the air was biting cold. In the corner, a thin mattress lay directly on the rot-infested floor. While Moon slept on imported silk in a climate-controlled fortress, his son had been shivering in the dark. A wave of nausea rolled over him, sharper than any knife wound. He had come here to execute a traitor, only to realize he was the villain. He had almost put a bullet in the mother of his child. He had left his heir to rot in the gutter. A small movement broke his paralysis. The boy stepped forward, his oversized superhero pajamas dragging on the dirty floor. He lifted a tiny finger and pointed at the massive desert eagle still clutched in Moon's hand. "Bad?" the boy asked, his voice innocent and soft. Moon looked at the weapon, then back at the child. He engaged the safety and holstered it. "Yes," Moon rasped, his voice thick with unspent emotion. "Bad." Slowly, the giant sank to the floor. For the first time in his life, the King of Chicago knelt, bringing his eyes level with the boy's. But the moment of redemption was shattered instantly. Outside, tires screeched against the wet pavement, followed by the heavy slam of car doors. The world wasn't done with them yet. Moon snapped to his feet, the tender father vanishing instantly. The soldier returned. He moved to the window, peering through the grime. A black SUV idled below, lights off. He cursed. In his obsession with finding a traitor, he had become careless. He wasn't the only one watching Valeria. The Volkovs had been tracking him, waiting for the invincible King of Chicago to lead him to his weakness. They didn't know about the boy yet, but they knew Moon was isolated, exposed, and far from his guards.
Heavy boots thundered on the wooden stairs. They weren't sneaking anymore. They were coming to finish the job. Panic flared in Moon's chest, but he strangled it. Yesterday, a fight meant losing money or territory. Tonight, it meant extinction. If he fell here, the miracle ended. The Moon bloodline would be wiped out before it even had a chance to breathe. He checked the magazine of his Desert Eagle. 7 rounds. There were at least 4 heavy footsteps approaching the door. The math was tight. He turned to Valeria. There was no time for explanations, no time for apologies for the gun he had held to her head moments ago. He grabbed her shoulder, his grip iron hard. "Take the boy," he commanded, his voice low and lethal. "Put him in the bathtub, cover his ears, and do not come out until it is quiet." Valeria barely clicked the bathroom lock when the apartment door splintered inward. Moon didn't wait. He fired twice, dropping the point man, but the second Russian returned fire. A hot slug tore through Moon's shoulder, spraying red mist against the peeling wallpaper.
He didn't feel it. Pain was a luxury. Survival was a necessity. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a father protecting his cub. He closed the distance, grabbing a pot of boiling water from the stove and hurling it into the gunman's face. As the man screamed, Moon silenced him with a savage swing of a cast-iron skillet. It wasn't a fight, it was a butchery. But amidst the chaos, a third assassin slipped past, sprinting toward the only closed door. He kicked the bathroom entrance open, raising his weapon toward the tub. Moon didn't run around the corner. He roared, launching his entire body through the rotting drywall that separated the kitchen from the bath. The wall crumbled like chalk. He tackled the gunman into the cracked tiles, his hands finding a throat instantly. There was no technique, only primal rage. He squeezed until the thrashing stopped, looking up to see Leo peeking over the rim of the bathtub, wide gray eyes witnessing exactly what his father was capable of. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Moon released his grip, and the assassin slumped lifelessly to the cracked tiles. The apartment was a ruin, a graveyard of cheap furniture and broken men. Moon gasped for air, clutching his bleeding shoulder, the adrenaline finally fading to reveal the agony beneath. He looked at the tub, expecting screams. Valeria was trembling violently, but Leo stood up. The boy's gaze didn't linger on the dead stranger. It locked onto Moon. In the chaos, the child's instinct recognized the truth. The violence hadn't been directed at him, but for him. He didn't recoil. Instead, he reached his small arms out toward the bloodied giant. Moon's heart shattered and reformed in a single beat. Distant sirens began to wail, cutting through the night. The police were minutes away. Moon couldn't leave them here, not in this filth, not anymore. He stripped off his ruined suit jacket, wrapping it around the small frame. He scooped Leo up with his good arm and grabbed Valeria's hand with the other. "Don't look down," he commanded gently, pressing the boy's face into his chest to shield him from the carnage in the kitchen. "Look at me." They walked out of the building. Neighbors peeked through cracked doors, watching in awe. They saw the terrifying enforcer limping and bleeding, but holding the child like a sacred relic. The king had claimed his family, and he was taking them home. The elevator doors to the penthouse slid open, revealing a world of glass and gold, miles away from the rot of the slums. Moon's personal guard raised their weapons at the sight of the blood, but Moon silenced them with a single sharp gesture. He didn't go to the infirmary. He went to the throne room. He summoned his lieutenants immediately. When they arrived, confused by the sight of the maid and a toddler in the war room, Moon offered no explanations. He stood tall, ignoring the throbbing in his shoulder, and placed a hand on the boy's head. "This is Leo," Moon declared, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "He is next." Later, the private physician confirmed the miracle. The previous diagnosis had been a statistical error, a 1 in a million anomaly. That single night of shared grief hadn't been a mistake. It was biological destiny finding a way through the impossible. As dawn broke over Chicago, Moon stepped onto the balcony. The city looked different now. It wasn't just territory to conquer, it was an inheritance to protect. He held Leo, fast asleep against his chest. Valeria stood beside him, no longer a ghost in the background, but the queen of the board. Moon looked out at the skyline, a cold smile touching his lips. "They thought I was the last," he whispered to the waking world. "They were wrong."